Why is there this enthusiasm for clamping down on speech that people find offensive? Because isn't that exactly what the founders of this country wrote the First Amendment? They didn't write it for Robert Frost poetry. They wrote it for, speech that makes people angry or uncomfortable, didn't they?
So it's a great question. The reason that we have the freedom of speech is so that we can rule ourselves. That's the basic point. There are other really good reasons, but the main one is so that a free people can continue to govern itself, by which I mean that they can publicly deliberate on all of the issues, pressing or not, that face the nation. And the reason that some parts of the left want to get rid of the freedom of speech is because they don't want self-rule as the principle of the nation. What they would rather have is the imposition on the nation of their new morality, because it turns out that there are a lot of conservatives in the country who don't want to be ruled that way. And the freedom of speech is how they show it. And by getting rid of the freedom of speech, the left has, in their clutches, almost total rule. And so you're going to see the left wanting to crack down on the freedom of speech more and more with each coming year.
Well, because when you start talking about hate speech, I've never liked the idea, the philosophy of hate speech laws. But if we're going to have them on the books, saying if a person goes out and attacks another person, physically assaults them, that's an assault. It's against the law in every state, every community in the United States. If you assault the person and shout racial epithets at the same time, leading perhaps a jury to believe that you assaulted the person because of their skin color, their race, their religion, their national origin, then there are communities that say that should be a bigger crime. I've never agreed with that because it does afford perhaps to some groups greater protection under the law or different treatment. And I think we should all get equal treatment under the law. If you commit a physical assault, there should be a penalty. Your motivation for committing the physical assault in most cases shouldn't be relevant at all. But if you're going to have those on the books, go ahead. But when it comes to trying to silence hate speech, how do we define that? I find people who casually talk about women's reproductive health as a euphemism for killing unborn babies. I find that especially hateful, killing unborn babies. And yet I'm willing to bet that my definition of hate speech is probably not the one they're talking about when they talk about trying to expand the definition of hate speech.
You're right about all that. So here is the way to define and think about hate speech. The left will tell you all sorts of fake arguments, like that hate speech leads to more violence. Hate speech should be regulated across the board so that no matter who you are, what you look like, what skin color you are, nobody can speak hate. That is not true. The real definition beneath hate speech is the following, that it has to do with the speech of the oppressive majority who the left openly defines as white. These are not my words, these are their words, who speak hatred against vulnerable, as they like to say, marginalized groups. So the key to understanding what these people want in criminalizing hate speech is that hate speech is a one-way street. It means that the majority, the oppressor majority, must be silenced, while the marginalized groups can not only speak as much as they want, but indeed must speak out against the so-called oppressive majority, because that's how they gain their liberation, their self-respect, and their dignity. Hate speech is a one-way street. That's the key.
And yet, does the law allow us that kind of one-way street where we say this isn't about race or religion, but it does benefit one group more than another? And I guess I'm reminded of a legal case from a long time ago. I think it was a precedent-setting case that went to the Supreme Court. A guy who was a bigot worked for a big power company, and they used to have to hire people to shovel coal. And he didn't want to hire black Americans to shovel coal, so he put in a requirement that said, to shovel coal, you have to have a high school diploma, knowing that most of the black Americans who would apply for the job at that time didn't have a high school diploma, and they would be locked out of the job. So it had the effect of discriminating, even though there was nothing about the rule that mentioned black or white or anything else. If you write a rule like this that says it will only work against white people and it will only work in favor, for instance, of people of color, Can you have a rule like that under our Constitution?
Okay, so that's an interesting point, and I would point out two things. Number one is that we already have laws like that. Affirmative action, it works in one direction.
Which I oppose.
Right. We have preferential government contracting, preferential government loans.
Yes.
So, yeah, you can oppose them, and so do I. But we actually already do have these kinds of unconstitutional laws on the books. So that's point number one. Point number two is, all of the European nations have already criminalized hate speech. And by criminalized, I mean there are criminal penalties. You can go to jail. You're not just fined. You can go to jail.
Yeah, like Mark Stein's trial up in Canada, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Canada has these laws, too. And so all of these laws are written in the way that you described. In other words, neutrally. They don't say that it's only one group that can't speak against another. They have general laws that say you can't speak against race, gender, ethnicity, etc. But in practice, these laws are only enforced in one way. And the reason for that is that the judges, the government functionaries who decide these things, the universities who decide these things, they all know what the game is about. And one of the proofs is that if you look at the public squares in Europe, you see that it's perfectly permissible to say all sorts of things against Christianity, against heterosexuality, against traditional families, against the heritage populations of those countries. Nobody is ever prosecuted, for that. But it's only applied when speaking about so-called marginalized groups.
But what happens then when that some of that stuff starts to come around full circle, doesn't it? Whose side do you then support? I'm not talking about you, but does the law support if, say, a Muslim, somebody who follows Islam, says that homosexuality is an abomination and that Jews and Christians we should think less of Jews and Christians. Now you've got a marginalized group, allegedly, or a religious minority that's actually speaking out against other protected classes. How do you run the rules then?
Yeah, so it's a chaos, and the left doesn't have a full answer to that. But if they do have an answer, then the answer is contained in what's called intersectionality. And in very brief, what that means is that, sure, there are a lot of various marginalized groups, but some groups have been marginalized more than others. So, for example, Ilhan Omar is a Muslim, she's a woman, and she's an immigrant, and she's black. That is 4 check marks in her favor to show that she is considerably more marginalized than, let's say, a white woman or a gay male. And so, in theory, she would have more power in this kind of hierarchy. And
Unbelievable. Arthur Milikh from the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Milikh, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. And there you go. Equal treatment under the law, but like Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show.